The letter she dropped found its way to his empire or, Buck Thursday Cote Dan Roy de Tim Dan de Che Quan. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. The rain painted silver streaks across the glass walls of Vale Tower, a building so tall it seemed to touch the clouds. Inside, under the dim glow of desk lamps and city lights, Adrian Vale, the 34-year-old CEO of Vale Group, stared at the chaos of headlines glowing on his monitor. Cold-hearted bachelor CEO dodges charity gala again. Vale Empire faces backlash over layoffs. He exhaled slowly, eyes tired but sharp. Public sympathy was collapsing, investors restless, and his PR team begged for something to humanize him. On his desk sat a torn craft envelope that had arrived by mistake earlier that day. It was addressed to the Vale Philanthropy Office, yet the handwriting soft, looping, almost trembling had caught his attention. Inside was a letter written on recycled paper, sealed with a pressed ginkgo leaf. The words were simple, heartfelt: a woman named Lynn Tran asking for a $2,000 micro-grant to start Letter Stitch, a community space offering free mending and handwritten letters for those too shy to speak their gratitude. Adrian had read it twice. No branding. No manipulation. Just raw sincerity. Something inside him stirred. When his PR director knocked and entered, voice brisk, "We need a narrative shift, sir. A positive human story. Maybe a charity partnership, a marriage rumor, something clean." Adrian leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "What if we do both?" That night, while rain hammered the windows of his penthouse, Adrian stared at the letter again. The ink had bled slightly from the rain, but the final line remained clear. Sometimes, even a letter that goes to the wrong address still finds the right heart. He smiled faintly. The next morning, Lynn Tran sat in a crowded bus rumbling through New York's Lower East Side, clutching her cracked phone and a note that read, "Interview Vale Tower, 11:30 a.m. She thought it was for a writing position in their charity office. She had no idea the man she was about to meet was the same CEO whose name flashed across every billboard she passed. When she arrived, the receptionist led her into a glass meeting room overlooking the city's skyline. Adrian Vale stood by the window, tall, composed, wearing a dark suit that reflected no warmth. "Miss Tran," he said, his tone calm, measured. "I read your letter." Her pulse raced. "I am so sorry, sir. It must have been delivered by mistake." "No," he replied, turning to face her. "I believe it came to the right place." He gestured for her to sit, then continued, "My company is under scrutiny, and we are preparing a campaign to rebuild public trust. I want you to help me, but not as a writer. As my fiancé." Lynn froze. "Your what?" "A temporary arrangement," he said, sliding a contract across the table. 6 months. Appear with me at public events. Pretend to be my partner. In exchange, I will fund your project and cover your mother's medical bills in full." The world tilted. She glanced at the paper terms, signatures, a number that made her breath catch. $200,000, she whispered. "And my mother's treatment?" "Already pre-approved," Adrian said softly. "All you need to do is say yes." The room fell silent except for the hum of rain against the glass. Lynn's hands trembled as she touched the envelope. Her own letter now returned to her, the ginkgo leaf still intact. She met his eyes. "You do not even know me." "That," he said, with a calm she could not read, "is precisely why this might work." Outside, thunder rolled over the city, as if sealing the deal before she could decide. Lynn looked down at the contract again, the ink sharp, the promise heavy. She thought of her mother lying in the hospital, the overdue rent notice taped to her door, and the dream that had started with one honest letter. Taking a slow breath, she whispered, "All right, Mr. Vale. But this is just business." Adrian nodded once, but as their hands brushed across the contract, something unspoken sparked something neither of them could yet name, and that was how a letter meant for help became the beginning of a contract that would test every rule of love and pride. The next morning, Lynn Tran sat in the backseat of a black sedan, hands folded tightly over the contract that had changed everything overnight. The city rolled by in streaks of gray and gold as dawn broke through the skyscrapers. Her reflection in the tinted window did not look like her anymore. A simple seamstress who mended torn jackets for neighbors had somehow become the fiancée of one of the richest men in New York. When the car stopped in front of Vale Tower, the driver opened her door, addressing her with a polite "Miss Tran." It still felt strange hearing that tone. Inside the building, everything smelled like polished glass and money. PR assistants rushed past, earpieces in, carrying folders and coffee trays. She was guided to the top floor where Adrian Vale waited, already dressed in a tailored gray suit. His presence filled the room, calm yet intimidating. "Good morning, Miss Tran," he said, eyes scanning the contract she had signed. "I trust you have read all the terms." "Every line," she replied, her voice steady though her stomach fluttered. "I keep promises, Mr. Vale." He nodded approvingly. "Then let us begin. For the next 6 months, you are my fiancé, you will accompany me to public events, live at the penthouse, and participate in interviews as required. There will be no physical expectations. This is business, nothing more." "I prefer it that way," she said quickly, though part of her felt the words sting. Within hours, her transformation began. A stylist took her measurements, makeup artists whispered in foreign accents, and a PR consultant handed her a list titled "The Rules of Elegance." She repeated them silently, smile when photographed. Keep answers short. Always let him lead. That evening, when she stepped out in a navy gown for the first press dinner, Adrian's expression barely changed but his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. Cameras flashed as they entered the ballroom together, hands loosely linked for the show. The reporters leaned forward like wolves. "Mr. Vale," one called, "how does it feel to be engaged at last?" Adrian smiled faintly. "It feels like the right partnership at the right time." Beside him, Lynn's heart hammered. She remembered the first rule, stay poised, so she smiled too, her voice quiet but clear. "Sometimes good things come from mistakes." The reporters laughed, unaware of how true it was. After the event, they returned to the penthouse. The elevator ride was silent, tension heavy but not hostile. When the doors opened, Lynn stepped into a world of marble and glass overlooking the Hudson River. "You will stay here," Adrian said. "There is a guest room prepared for you. The staff knows to respect your privacy." She nodded. "This is more than I am used to." "Then take your time," he replied. Luxury loses meaning when it is forced. For a moment, the distance between them felt less like an ocean. Later that night, alone in her room, Lynn unpacked a small box from her bag. Inside was her mother's photo and the pressed ginkgo leaf that had sealed her letter. She placed them on the bedside table as if to anchor herself. Down the hall, Adrian stood by the window of his office, staring at the skyline. He told himself this arrangement was practical, strategic. Yet her words at the dinner replayed in his mind, sometimes good things come from mistakes. He realized he had smiled not for the cameras, but for her. Days turned into weeks. They attended business lunches, charity events, and endless interviews. The world believed in their love story. But behind the cameras, they existed in a fragile truce of professionalism. Lynn worked quietly on her community project with the foundation team, often staying late in the office next to his. Sometimes Adrian would walk in, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, and ask, "Do you ever rest?" She would smile faintly and reply, "I do when things stop needing to be fixed." Those small exchanges began to chip away at the wall between them. One evening, when a storm knocked out the power, Lynn found Adrian in the kitchen lighting candles. The glow cast shadows across his face, making him look softer, almost human. "So the Empire has blackouts too," she teased. Adrian chuckled, a rare sound. "Even empires need fixing sometimes." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that lingered long after. As thunder rolled beyond the windows, neither spoke again, but something had shifted. Beneath the contract and the cameras, a truth was beginning to write itself, one heartbeat at a time. Weeks passed, and the world seemed to buy into their performance completely. Every magazine headline called them the perfect match, every business outlet praised Adrian Vale's newfound warmth, and Lynn's quiet grace became the new face of the Vale brand. Yet behind closed doors, the air between them carried something unspoken, fragile, almost dangerous. Lynn had begun spending her days working with the Vale Foundation's Community Grant Division. She wrote proposals, approved budgets, and often suggested microloans for seamstresses like herself. At first, Adrian only observed from afar, convinced that her involvement was just part of their deal. But one evening, he walked into the office to find her still there, her hair pulled back, eyes tired but glowing over a spreadsheet. "You are still here?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "There are easier ways to pretend," she said softly without looking up. "Pretend? You wanted a fiancé who looks good in front of cameras. I wanted funds for a dream. But the people this foundation helps, they are real. I cannot fake that." Adrian watched her fingers move across the paper, her sincerity disarming. "Maybe," he murmured, "you are better at this than I am." That night, for the first time, he stayed to help her finish the reports. They shared coffee from a paper cup, working side by side until the city lights dimmed into dawn. When she fell asleep on the couch, he draped his jacket over her shoulders. The next morning, she woke to find the jacket and a note, "You make this place feel human again." As the weeks unfolded, something in Adrian shifted. He began showing up at smaller charity events without cameras. He met the tailors, the cleaners, the night shift staff who had built his empire silently. Lynn saw him laugh with an old janitor who had worked there for 30 years. For the first time, the smile was genuine. But the closer they grew, the more Lynn feared the truth of their arrangement. The line between performance and reality was blurring. One afternoon, as she prepared for a board gala, she overheard two executives whispering near the elevator. "It is all fake," one of them sneered. "She is a hired fiancé, once the PR blows over, she will disappear." Lynn froze. Her stomach twisted with humiliation. Later that evening, as Adrian adjusted his cufflinks, she stood in the doorway of his office. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long before I am supposed to disappear?" He looked up, puzzled. "What are you talking about?" "Do not," she interrupted, voice trembling, "pretend you do not know what your people say. To them, I am a prop with a pulse. And maybe they are right." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You think I see you that way?" "What else could I think?" she shot back. "This is all built on a contract." He hesitated, then said, "That may have been true in the beginning, but not anymore." His words hung in the air, too heavy to believe. She turned away, afraid of what might happen if she stayed. The gala that night glittered with chandeliers and champagne. Lynn walked beside Adrian, smiling for the cameras, but her heart felt hollow. During the event, the host invited her to speak. She stepped to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. "They call this a partnership," she began, her voice steady despite the ache inside. "But partnership is not about status or signatures. It is about building something that lasts when the lights are gone." Her words silenced the room. Adrian watched her, admiration and guilt intertwining. After the speech, he found her by the balcony, away from the flashing lights. "You were incredible," he said softly. "Do not," she whispered, "say things you do not mean." Rain began to fall again, soft against the glass roof. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Lynn, this started as an arrangement. But somewhere along the way, I forgot it was one." She faced him, eyes wide, conflicted. "You should not say that." "Why not?" "Because," she said, voice breaking, "when this ends, I will be the only one left believing it was real." And with that, she walked away, leaving him standing in the rain-soaked glow of his own empire, unsure for the first time in his life whether the deal he made had cost him the one thing money could never buy. Days turned into silence between them. Lynn moved out of the penthouse and back into her small apartment near Chinatown, where the street noise replaced the echo of marble floors. She avoided the news, avoided the glittering world that had almost swallowed her. But the story of her disappearance only fueled curiosity. Tabloids ran headlines like "Runaway Fiancé of Vale Empire" and "Was the engagement just a publicity stunt?" The attention made her sick. She went back to sewing in her tiny corner shop, fixing coats for neighbors and writing letters for clients who could not find the words themselves. Each night, she replayed their last conversation, the rain, his voice breaking, the truth she was too afraid to believe. Meanwhile, in the Vale Tower, Adrian faced his own storm. Investors questioned his focus. The board demanded explanations. The CFO, a sharp-tongued woman named Veronica Lee, cornered him in the conference room. "You have made us a laughingstock," she hissed. That woman was a hired actress, and now the entire city knows. Adrian slammed his pen on the table. She was not hired to act. She was hired to remind this company what integrity looks like. Veronica scoffed. "Then you should have kept your heart out of it." Her words hit harder than he expected. That night, he sat alone in his office, staring at the framed ginkgo leaf that had once sealed Lynn's letter. It reminded him of something he could not buy back: trust. Weeks later, an anonymous leak hit the internet, a scanned copy of their original contract. Every clause, every signature, public for the world to see. Reporters camped outside Vale Tower, calling it the fake love scandal. Lynn saw the news while making tea in her apartment. Her hands shook so violently that the cup shattered against the floor. She thought of her mother, now recovering in the hospital, who would see her daughter's name dragged through the mud. The phone rang. It was Adrian. "Do not believe what they say," he pleaded. "Someone leaked it to destroy us." "There is no us," she said quietly. "There was a deal. It is over." He could hear the tears she refused to let fall, but before he could respond, the line went dead. The next morning, Adrian walked into the board meeting, calm but cold. "Find out who leaked the document," he ordered. Days later, he learned the truth: it had been Veronica. She had sold the file to a media outlet to pressure him into stepping down. Instead of firing her, he called a press conference. Cameras flashed as he stood at the podium, holding the same craft envelope that had started everything. "Months ago," he began, "a letter arrived at my office by mistake. It was written by a woman who asked for a small grant to help others. That letter changed the way I saw the world and myself. What began as a business decision became something far greater." He paused, the crowd silent. "The contract you have all seen was real. But what happened after that was not scripted." Somewhere across the city, Lynn stood frozen before the television in her shop, her heart pounding as his voice carried through the screen. "I owe her more than an apology," Adrian continued. "I owe her the truth. She reminded me that love without honesty is just another transaction. And I refuse to build an empire on lies." Reporters erupted in questions, but he walked away, leaving them with the sound of his confession echoing across every channel. Hours later, as dusk fell over the city, a gentle knock came at the door of Lynn's shop. She opened it to find a courier holding a small wooden box. Inside lay the framed ginkgo leaf, the original letter she had written, and a note in Adrian's handwriting: "No more contracts. Just promises kept." Lynn held the frame against her chest, tears spilling freely for the first time. Outside, neon lights flickered across the wet pavement, reflecting her trembling smile. Somewhere high above the skyline, in his office, Adrian looked out the window, wondering if she would ever forgive him. Neither of them knew it yet, but that letter was about to find its way home again. It had been 3 months since the scandal. The city had moved on to its next headline, but Adrian Vale had not. He withdrew from public life, sold part of his shares, and quietly resigned from the Vale Group's daily operations. The board called it strategic restructuring, but insiders knew the truth had stepped down for her. Meanwhile, Lynn's shop had grown busier than ever. The publicity that once humiliated her had turned into unexpected support. People from across the city came to have their clothes mended and their letters written by the girl who taught a billionaire how to feel. She never corrected them. She simply smiled, sewed quietly, and pretended her heart was fine. One cold morning, as she prepared to open the shop, a group of familiar faces appeared at her door. They were members of the Vale Foundation team. "Miss Tran," one of them said, "Mr. Vale asked us to deliver this." They handed her a thick envelope. Inside was a formal invitation embossed with gold. Common Letters Fund Grand Opening Ceremony. Director Lynn Tran. Beneath it, a handwritten note from Adrian read, "You started this dream. It should have your name on it. Please come." Her hands trembled as she read it. For a long time, she just stared at the invitation, torn between anger, pride, and something softer that refused to die. That evening, she walked to the new foundation building downtown. It was smaller than the glass towers she remembered, but warm, filled with hand-painted murals and shelves of donated books. People moved about setting up tables, laughter echoing. Near the center stood Adrian, wearing a simple black coat, no bodyguards, no cameras, just him. When he saw her, he froze. Then, slowly, he smiled, not the CEO's practiced smile but the real one she had seen only once before. "You came," he said quietly. "You asked," she replied. "This is yours," he said, gesturing around. "I only built the walls. You built the purpose." "I did not do it alone," she said softly. "You gave the chance." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy but peaceful. Then she asked, "Why step down? Why give all this away?" Adrian looked at her, eyes calm. "Because it was never about the empire. It was about finding something worth keeping after the empire falls." Lynn felt her throat tighten. "And did you?" He took a step closer, holding her gaze. "I did. But I lost it." She swallowed hard. "You did not lose it. You let it go." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a silver crane folded from the same paper as her letter, a tiny ginkgo leaf pressed in its wings. "This was my reminder," he said. "Of a woman who believed even a wrong letter could find the right heart." Tears welled in her eyes. "Adrian, no contracts this time," he said, voice steady. "No conditions. Just one question." He opened the box, revealing a simple silver ring. "Will you choose me again, this time for real?" The air seemed to hold its breath. Lynn looked down at the ring, then back at the man who had once been untouchable and now stood before her with nothing but truth. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "But only if we keep writing the story together." Adrian smiled through a breath that trembled. "That is the only deal I want." Applause erupted around them as the staff, who had been quietly watching, cheered. But Lynn hardly heard them. The world blurred until there was only his voice and her heartbeat. Later that night, as the foundation lights dimmed, they stood by the window overlooking the quiet city. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Every mistake that brought me here," he said, taking her hand, "is one I would make again." She smiled. "Then let us never stop making the right ones by accident." They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that carried peace. And as the snow began to fall outside, Adrian kissed her forehead gently and whispered, "The letter you dropped did not just find its way to my empire, Lynn. It found its way home." Spring arrived quietly in New York, carrying the smell of rain and new beginnings. The Common Letters Foundation was thriving, and Lynn had become its heart. Every morning, she greeted the volunteers by name, helped sew patches on donated clothes, and spent evenings reading the handwritten letters people dropped off. Some were confessions, some apologies, others thank yous to strangers who had changed their lives. She often smiled to herself, remembering how one letter had changed hers. Adrian visited the foundation often, but never as the billionaire CEO he once was. He came in jeans, rolled-up sleeves, and carried boxes of supplies with the volunteers. The newspapers had begun to call him the reformed mogul, but he brushed it off with humor. "I just carry things now," he would say, and Lynn would laugh, knowing he meant it. Their relationship had grown in quiet ways: morning coffees, late-night walks through the city, conversations that went beyond contracts and money. They had stopped pretending. One Friday evening, Lynn found him repairing a broken table in the workshop. "You know," she said, leaning on the doorway, "most billionaires do not fix their own furniture." Adrian smiled without looking up. "Then they do not know how satisfying it is to finish something with their own hands." She walked closer, brushing sawdust off his shoulder. "You have changed," she said softly. "No," he replied, glancing up at her, "I just stopped hiding." That weekend, the foundation hosted a community exhibition showcasing stories written by the people it had helped. Hundreds attended: students, workers, elderly couples, each carrying a letter that had meant something. When Adrian stepped onto the small stage to welcome everyone, he paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. "A few years ago," he began, "I believed success meant never showing weakness. Then I met someone who taught me that honesty is not weakness. It is strength." His eyes found Lynn's across the room. "She taught me that even a mistake can be a beginning, not an ending." The audience applauded, unaware that those words were for her alone. Later that night, after the event ended and the lights dimmed, Lynn walked out to the terrace. The city glittered below like spilled stars. Adrian joined her, holding 2 cups of tea instead of champagne. "You could have given that speech to any of your partners," she teased. "But only one of them wrote me a letter first," he said, smiling. The wind caught her hair, and he reached to tuck a loose strand behind her ear. They stood quietly for a moment, the hum of traffic below mixing with the soft rhythm of their breaths. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. "The empire, the power, the rush?" He thought for a long time before answering. "Sometimes I miss the noise. But I never miss the silence that came with it." She nodded. "I used to think love and ambition could not live in the same place," she whispered. "Maybe they can," he said. "Maybe they just needed the right foundation." She smiled at the wordplay, shaking her head. "You have gotten better at speeches." "That happens when you have a good editor," he said. "Or a good reason to speak." He placed his cup down and took her hand gently. "Lynn, this foundation started because of your letter. But I think we both know it was never about charity. It was about learning what matters. I want us to keep building together. Not as a story for others to read, but as our life." Her eyes softened. "And what would we build next, Mr. Vale?" He squeezed her hand. "Something ordinary. Something real." The city lights flickered like an answer. As they stood there, side by side, Lynn realized that the story that had begun with a mistake had turned into something extraordinary, not because of its drama, but because of its truth. She rested her head on his shoulder, whispering, "Then let us build ordinary miracles." Adrian smiled, wrapping his arm around her as the first raindrops began to fall again. Somewhere far below, a forgotten letter fluttered across the street, caught by the wind, proof that sometimes even lost things find their way home again. Summer came early that year, wrapping the city in golden light and the hum of possibility. The Common Letters Foundation was planning its biggest event yet, a gala to raise funds for community schools. For Lynn, it felt like closing a circle, the same kind of event where her story with Adrian had once begun, only now she stood on the other side of it. She spent weeks preparing, organizing guest lists, writing speeches, and designing invitations sealed with a small ginkgo leaf, a quiet nod to the letter that had started it all. Adrian watched her work tirelessly, his admiration growing with every detail she perfected. One evening, while reviewing the final layout for the stage, she looked up to find him standing by the doorway with 2 coffees in hand. "You should rest," he said softly. "You say that as if you ever do," she replied, smiling. "Touché," he murmured, handing her a cup. They sat together in the quiet hall surrounded by half-finished decorations and the faint scent of fresh paint. "Do you remember our first gala?" she asked. "How could I forget?" he said with a grin. "You nearly called me out in front of the entire board." "Because you deserved it," she teased. "You were impossible then." "And now?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "Now you are impossible in a better way." Adrian laughed quietly, shaking his head. "You make me sound like a reformed villain." "Maybe you were," she said softly. "But you learned." Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them was filled with the same quiet electricity that had first bound them together. When the night of the gala arrived, the ballroom glittered under strings of warm lights. Guests mingled, music floated, and laughter echoed through the space. Lynn stood near the entrance greeting donors and old friends, her silver gown catching the light every time she moved. Across the room, Adrian watched her, his heart full of pride and something deeper he could no longer hide. When it was time for her speech, the crowd quieted. Lynn took the stage, holding a single folded letter in her hand. "Many years ago," she began, "a letter I wrote ended up in the wrong hands. Or at least, I thought it did, but sometimes, life knows better than we do. That mistake became the beginning of something larger, a reminder that compassion can travel farther than we imagine." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes shone. "This foundation exists because of that lesson. Because one act of kindness can rewrite a story not just for one person, but for a whole community." The room erupted in applause. As she stepped down from the stage, Adrian was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. "You were perfect," he whispered. "You still say that word too easily," she replied. "Not tonight," he said. Later, as the gala wound down, the crowd thinned, leaving only soft music and the sparkle of the chandeliers. Adrian took her hand and led her to the balcony overlooking the city. "Do you know what I see when I look at all of this?" he asked. "A success story," she guessed. He shook his head. "I see a letter that finally found its destination." Lynn smiled through the tears in her eyes. "And what happens next?" she asked. "We keep writing," he said simply. "One chapter at a time." The morning after the gala, sunlight poured through the wide glass windows of the foundation, painting everything in a golden calm. The event had been a complete success. Donations exceeded every expectation, and articles praised Lynn Tran as the woman who had redefined philanthropy with humility. Yet beneath the applause and headlines, Lynn felt a quiet key unfinished truth between her and Adrian. For months, they had moved side by side like partners who shared everything except one final promise. That day, Adrian asked her to meet him at the old Vale Tower, now half renovated into a community space. When she arrived, the lobby looked nothing like the corporate fortress she remembered. The marble had been replaced with warm wood, and the giant company logo had been replaced by a single line engraved into the wall built on letters, "Not lies." She smiled softly, tracing the words with her fingertips. Then she saw him. Adrian stood in the center of the hall, wearing a simple dark suit, no tie, holding the original craft envelope between his hands. "You kept it all this time," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course I did," he replied. "It was the first honest thing anyone had ever sent to me." He took a deep breath. "Do you remember what you wrote at the end of that letter?" She nodded slowly. "That even the smallest act of kindness can outlive us." He smiled. "It did. It outlived the contracts, the headlines, the mistakes. It built everything you see here." She looked around, realizing that every corner of the new foundation, every idea, every life changed had grown from that one act of courage. "You wanted me to see this?" she asked. "I wanted you to see what you built," he said gently. "And I wanted to tell you that I am ready." "Ready for what?" she asked, though she already knew. He stepped closer, eyes steady. "To stop being afraid of what is real." Her heart quickened as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded paper crane, the same kind he had made from her letter long ago. Inside its wings rested a simple gold ring. Lin Tran, he said softly, you once taught me that a mistake can become a miracle. So here I am, asking for mine. Will you marry Menet as part of a contract, not as a story, but as my choice? Tears filled her eyes, spilling before she could stop them. You always did have a way with words, she whispered, smiling through the tears. Only when the words are about you, he replied. She took the crane from his hand, unfolding it carefully to reveal the ring. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she slipped it onto her finger and whispered, yes. 1,000 times yes. Adrian let out a breath that sounded like relief and joy all at once. The room around them felt alive, as if the building itself was breathing again. He pulled her into his arms, not with the careful restraint of a man guarding his image, but with the warmth of someone who had finally found home. The letter you dropped, he murmured against her hair, changed my empire. She smiled, resting her forehead against his. No, she said softly. It built ours. 1 year later, the city bloomed under the gentle warmth of spring again. The Common Letters Foundation had expanded to 3 new branches, each one carrying the same motto engraved on its walls, built on letters, not lies. Inside the original building, sunlight streamed through the tall windows as volunteers arranged flowers and folded hundreds of tiny paper cranes. Today was not another gala or press event. Today was their wedding day. Lin stood before a mirror in a simple ivory gown she had sewn herself, every stitch carrying a memory of where she had come from. She smiled as she placed the pressed ginkgo leaf into her bouquet, the same one that had once sealed her letter to the Veil Foundation. Outside, the courtyard buzzed with laughter. Friends, neighbors, and the very people who had once been helped by the foundation gathered together. There were no reporters, no flashing lights, just genuine warmth. Adrian waited at the end of the aisle, wearing a suit that was classic yet modest, his tie the same deep green as the ginkgo leaf. When Lin appeared, the chatter faded into silence. She walked slowly, her eyes locked on his. Every step felt like the closing of a long, beautiful letter. When she reached him, Adrian took her hands gently. The officiant spoke briefly, but the real vows were theirs. Once, I asked you to marry me for a deal, Adrian said, voice steady but thick with emotion. You said yes, out of duty. Then I asked you again, not as a CEO, but as a man who had finally learned what love meant. And now, standing here, I realize that love was never about promises written on paper. It was about keeping them in action. Lin smiled through tears. You taught me that second chances are not given, they are built. And that kindness, even when it goes unnoticed, can change everything. They exchanged rings, both simple gold bands engraved with a single line inside our letter found home. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, applause and laughter filled the courtyard. Adrian kissed her softly, the kind of kiss that carried gratitude more than passion, the kind that said we made it. Later, as the guests enjoyed food and music, Lin and Adrian slipped away to the small garden behind the building. Beneath a tree covered in strings of cranes, they stood together, watching the sun set over the city that had once nearly broken them. Do you ever think about what would have happened if that letter had gone to the right address? She asked quietly. Adrian smiled, shaking his head. Then I would have spent the rest of my life wondering what I had missed. Lin rested her head on his shoulder, her voice a whisper. It seems every wrong turn brought us right here. And I would not change a single one, he said. As twilight deepened, the paper cranes swayed in the breeze, catching the light like small blessings. In the center of the garden, a framed plaque read in honor of the letter that found its way home. And as they stood there, hand in hand, the city lights flickering beyond, Lin and Adrian knew that some mistakes are not accidents at all, they are destiny written in human handwriting, sealed not with ink, but with faith.